In this lecture, we're going to be looking at probation and parole, um, looking at the different functions, the definitions of the two, the history of them, basically as alternatives to incarceration. One of them occurs typically in lieu of incarceration, and the other one occurs after the excuse me after a period of incarceration. This is a chart just looking at the correctional population and the increases most notably can be found in the probation population, going from about 1 million in 1980 to over 4 million in 2009. So what is probation? It's a sentence not involving confinement. It's a conditional release from incarceration, typically instead of prison or jail. Sometimes it can be added on to the end of a sentence after a period of incarceration. It's sentenced for people are sentenced to probation for felonies or misdemeanors, and it's the most widely used sanction. Factors leading to someone being put on probation could be the result of plea bargaining. It could be the result of a pre-sentence report, depending on what the court finds, what the probation officer in the pre-sentence report finds, that the person would be benefited by being on probation, not being in an incarcerated setting. It might just be, like I said, a plea bargain, what the person wants to do. Oftentimes, people that have been in the system before would prefer a short jail sentence over a longer period of probation. So people would typically prefer a 6-month jail sentence to a year or 2 years probation. It could be based on the prosecutor's recommendation, again, just depending on what the circumstances of the trial are. It could be based on the community reaction to the crime. Do they want the people to be incarcerated? Do they want them to have an opportunity to serve their sentence in the community? That's going to come up a lot with a lot of the criminal cases in response to unrest during the protest. What the people of the community want is going to dictate a lot in terms of how strict some of the punishments might be. Also, just depending on when they're adjudicated. For instance, 4 people were recently charged in trying to pull down the statue of Andrew Jackson in Lafayette Park outside of the White House. They could face up to 10 years in prison. They clearly did that. They're on video and on lots of still images trying to do that. So how fervently the government pursues that case could be very telling in terms of the community response. If I was their lawyers, I would do my level best to try to get any court dates pushed back, certainly beyond the election, if not beyond January 17th of next year. There could be political considerations, as I just mentioned. There's been a lot of speculation about political people making decisions based on running for re-election in some of the cases in Atlanta, particularly during I believe it was the second night of protest. It might have been the first night of protest, where 2 students were, they ended up finding out they were students, were pulled out of a car and arrested on live television. I was watching it live when it happened. According to the police chief at the time, who was later resigned a week later based on the developing events that took place, had basically talked to the mayor and agreed that the officers would be fired, potentially maybe just retired, because one of the officers has been with the department about 18 years. And then the next day found out that the prosecutor, Paul Howard, who is it's currently June 29th, so he lost in the general primary and is now in a runoff for the Democratic nomination for district attorney in Fulton County against one of his former subordinates right now. But there was a lot of speculation that there was political motivation behind the charging of those officers that were involved in that situation. I don't really want to go into the shooting investigation that started a week after that, mostly because the official report from the GBI, again, June 29th, as it is today, is not out yet. So I would want to refer to that before making any comments about that particular case. Also, could be based on the court backlog for probation. It could be based on the space in the prisons or jails, if they're overcrowded or if they're full. If they're completely full, sometimes you legally can't put more people in there. In addition, it could be the judge's discretion. Judge or jury, depending on who's actually giving a sentence in a case. So whatever they think, taking in all the other things into consideration, what they think about a particular circumstance. Types of probation. The most common is just straight probation, where you go and meet with an officer. Sometimes you have to take those whiz quizzes, satisfy other requirements. It could be community service, taking drug or alcohol awareness classes. Unfortunately, uh, again, if we were in a classroom setting, I would say that this is the time where nobody needs to raise their hand. But unfortunately, too many people that are going to be viewing this video in this course know all too well what the process for probation is. Also, suspended sentence probation, where you're given a sentence of incarceration that is suspended pending successful completion of the probation. It's a little bit more serious. It could be a split sentence. Like I said, you could have a period of incarceration and then a period of probation after that. It could be shock probation, typically done for first-time offenders or people that haven't actually been incarcerated in the past. They'll sentence them to a period of incarceration, and then after 6 months, maybe 3 months, year, depending on how long it is, they'll come back before the court and, how do you like prison? It's not that great. Would you like to go out on probation? Like, yes. So again, just sort of showing them the potential benefits of being able to serve a sentence in the community. Some people don't like it. Some people want to just stay incarcerated, do the time, and get out because they don't want to have to deal with, taking drug tests or having to meet with a probation officer once a month or twice a month. They just want to get the time and do it. You also have residential probation, where that's in a halfway, not really a halfway house situation because that's exiting a prison, but you're basically in a residential community. It could be for people that have insecurity in their own housing situation, or if they need to be removed from a unhealthy housing situation, that can be an option, having the residential probation. The objectives of probation, they assist the court in sentencing and completion of the pre-sentencing report. They offer community protection, and they offer a social service sort of lifeline to the offender to hopefully act as a controlling factor, an anchor point, someone that they have to live up to a particular standard for. Um, the problem is that a lot of times in the application of modern probation, officers don't have much time to spend with each client. The history of probation in the United States goes back to around the early 1800s. We see an individual, John Augustus, who was a cobbler. He was a shoemaker. And he would go to court when people were having their initial appearances, and he would offer to take them in, teach them his trade, and then he would offer a report to the court when their time for the trial came. Just trying to give people an ability to pull themselves up, to better themselves, to change their patterns of behavior that led them to the point of being arrested and potentially incarcerated. And for the people that were in the program, it had a fairly positive effect on a lot of them. So we see that policy sort of adopted into what we see as the modern probation system. In the early 1920s, they tried to offer a lot of social and psychological considerations, have a lot of individual time with the individuals, figuring ways to keep them from committing more crimes in the future. We see that shift to sort of social services aspect in the 1960s, trying to give people access to public programs that they might take advantage of, whether that's housing programs, educational programs, ways that the government was creating to help people pull themselves up. Now, because a lot of those were defunded in the early 1970s and more money was put into law enforcement, that's when we see probation officers become what they are today, which is basically risk management. Doing drug tests, trying to discern if people are going to be likely to commit offenses, and try to not have them uh, um, have the means, the opportunity to commit those offenses. but that's basically what modern probation is now. Some of the philosophy of probation holds that not all offenders are dangerous. The community does need to have some sort of protection, but at the same time, it's better for the offenders to have an ability to rehabilitate themselves. Um, the role of a probation officer is dual, the counselor and the enforcer, although, again, modern probation, it's more the enforcer, just because a lot of times probation officers have hundreds of clients, so hundreds of people they have to meet with every month or every 2 weeks. It makes it almost impossible to have any sort of specialized care or treatment. It's also used to reduce overcrowding in institutions. It's much cheaper than incarceration, to the point where now we have these private probation companies that are actually profiting off of this versus spending $40,000 to $60,000 to keep someone incarcerated in a correctional setting. And also, prisons are very dangerous. It's not good to have people incarcerated there if they don't need to be. It's exposure to violence, sexual, financial victimization, and that's not something that someone should be subjected to because they had a gram of cocaine or a gram of heroin and were arrested. The stages of probation: a person is first placed on probation by the court. You then have the supervision of the probationer in the community by the probation officer. And then once all of the conditions are met, whether that's conditions of hours or paying fines or a certain number of months on probation, you have the termination of services. Parole is different from probation because it is a conditional release from prison. It allows the individuals to finish their sentence in the community. Also gives them the opportunity to reduce the time they're incarcerated and offer an ability to reintegrate into the community while still having that connection to the system through the parole officer. It's used to reduce overcrowding in a lot of situations, and also, as we'll see in the next slide, we look at the sort of evolution of prison. Parole is a very useful tool for correctional systems because it gives the inmates a reason to behave. The two components: the parole release, which is decided by it's usually different in every state. In Georgia, we have the Board of Pardons and Parole. They review the cases. If someone is released on parole, then they are then supervised through a parole officer. Again, two types. You have the straight parole, which is where you meet with the officer. Again, it could be every week, every 2 weeks, every month. And then also residential parole, which is basically released into a halfway house where you have to stay there. You have to be back by a certain time of day. You can't be drunk or high. Again, much more restrictions. Again, sort of halfway in between a correctional setting and being released. Again, some of the differences here: parole is not based on the court; it's based on the government institution in the state that grants the parole, which again in Georgia is the Board of Pardons and Parole. Parole is for persons leaving a prison sentence. Probation is a sentence of community supervision. Probation is revoked by the court and/or the probation officer. Parole is revoked by the same agency that grants it, so the Board of Pardons and Parole. The parole board selects and places the prisoners on parole, controls the parolees in the community through the parole officers, removes people from parole, either sending them back for periods of reincarceration or once all the conditions are met, removing them from parole. Basically, if someone is on parole, they're still, for all intents and purposes, under the supervision of the correctional system. So when they finish that parole period, finishing their sentence, they're then not under that supervision anymore. They also review parole violations. Eligibility for parole: there could be legal restrictions depending on what the crime was, depending on what state they're in, depending on how many previous convictions they've had. There's no parole in the federal system. There's no right to parole. It's just, again, based on the laws regarding the crime, the circumstances, and what the sentence was. It's a reward for good behavior. The way the parole hearings are held, they're typically private. You have the board, the inmate, representative of the institution, the victim or the prosecutor can show up. Sometimes they make efforts to make them aware, make a victim aware of parole in a situation, but they don't always um, get the message. But they might not they don't want to show up. They're typically private. They did do OJ's in Nevada, was on television. That was kind of strange. That whole thing has been a circus since it started, um, you know, 27 years ago now. Some other issues that come up with release from prison is mandatory release. So parole is an early release, but if the person has done their time, then they have to be released. We can't just keep them incarcerated. So if they hit the maximum time plus any good time they may have accrued, then they're out. As far as conditions placed on a parolee, it can be a variety of things. They're not supposed to congregate with other felons other than outside of a halfway house situation. You can't own firearms. A lot of times you have to be completely sober, refraining from alcohol. Um, it really just depends on what the crime was, what is situationally specific to benefit the individual, to protect the community. It can be a variety of things. It's also important to note with parole violations, the majority of people that are put on parole that are reincarcerated are not done so for a new crime. Instead of going through the entire criminal justice system, if the offense is not that serious, it's a felony, but not something that um, is going to have, if the time left on the current sentence is equitable to how much time the person would receive, they'd go through the whole process to reconvict them. They'll typically just revoke the parole and send them back to prison for the remainder of the sentence. It's much quicker, cheaper, and easier on the system. And then that's for new offenses. It could be based on a new crime happening. It could be just a failure to adhere to the conditions. And those things are reviewed by the parole board, and they decide whether or not to reincarcerate the person. If you do have the parole revoked, you're not going to have another opportunity to get out on parole for that sentence. So get one bite of the apple as far as that goes. So in the next slide, PowerPoint, we're going to look at the history of the correctional system and what the sort of structure of the prison system looks like.